This is lesson 20. We're going to be covering Schedule 3 through 5 controlled substances. And these are pages 102 to 105 in your book. So these are the general rules for Schedule 3 through 5 prescriptions. Unfortunately, there's not as many rules for Schedule 3 through 5 as there were for Schedule 2, so this is a much shorter section. So first of all, Schedule 3 through 5 prescriptions can be issued electronically, and that's mandatory in Florida. But if one of the exceptions apply, they can also be issued in writing, verbally, and by fax as well. We mentioned this earlier, but Florida has a specific restriction on Schedule 3 controlled substances that are called in. Verbal prescriptions cannot be more than a 30-day supply, so make sure you remember that because it's a very unique situation that Florida has. Schedule 3 through 5 prescriptions can be refilled, unlike Schedule 2 prescriptions, but the refills are limited to 5 times within a 6-month period from when the prescription was issued. So it's either 5 times in total and then the prescription is done, or if 6 months pass and they've only gotten 2 prescriptions, it may be authorized for 5, but only got 2 during that 6-month time period, then the prescription also expires after 6 months. So whichever comes first, either 5 refills or 6 months, whichever comes first. Now the study tip on page 103 talks about partial fills. Remember that distinction we talked about in the last lesson. A partial fill is not a refill. It's a partial fill of the original quantity. So there's really no limitation on the number of partial fills that can be provided for Schedule 3 through 5, as long as the total number of dosage units aren't exceeded and also the 6-month time period is not exceeded. And some students seem to have trouble with this, and I think it might be because some computer systems in pharmacies count these partial dispensings and partial fills as refills. And for Schedule 3 through 5, sometimes the computer will cut them off after 5 partial fills. That's not legally accurate because, for instance, if the patient was given a Schedule 3 through 5 prescription for a 30-day supply with 5 refills, but they only wanted to pick up a week supply, they can come back after another week and get another one, another week and get another one, another week and get another one. Now they've done 4 weeks, they've gotten the first 30-day supply. That's the original quantity. After they've done this 5 times, do you cut them off? No. But some computers count each of those partial fills as refills and automatically cut them off and request a new prescription. That's not legally correct because they're entitled to the full 30-day supply up to 5 times within 6 months. So just be careful about that. Make sure you read that study tip on the top of page 103 carefully. Okay, let's talk about transfers. Because Schedule 3 through 5 controlled substances can have refills, those refills can be transferred from one pharmacy to another. So let's say you have a prescription filled at pharmacy A, but you find yourself on the other side of town at pharmacy B, you need to get your prescription refilled, you can have the refills transferred to the pharmacy B and get your prescription filled there. However, for controlled substance prescriptions, Schedule 3 through 5, this can only be done one time. So once you transfer from pharmacy A to pharmacy B, you must get all your refills at pharmacy B. They can't be transferred to pharmacy C or back to pharmacy A. So that's the general rule for Schedule 3 through 5 controlled substances. However, if the pharmacies share an online system, like within the Walgreens system or something like that, that one-time transfer rule doesn't apply. They can be transferred more than once, and you can pick it up at multiple Walgreens pharmacies. So that kind of makes sense for pharmacies that share an online database. Well, what about a transfer of the original prescription, not the refill? Remember, I talked about refills being transferred. Can you transfer the original prescription if it was sent to one pharmacy, but either was sent to the wrong pharmacy or they don't have it in stock, so it needs to go to another pharmacy? The transfer rule under the DEA regulations say that refills may be transferred. It doesn't say that original prescriptions can be transferred. However, DEA has put out a policy that says, you know what, if it's an electronic prescription, it was just sent to the wrong pharmacy or that pharmacy doesn't have it in stock and it needs to go to another pharmacy, then that first pharmacy could actually transfer the original prescription electronically to another pharmacy if their pharmacy system has that capability using what's called an electronic sharing program. Now, this was a DEA policy and it was restricted to only electronic prescriptions, not to an original written prescription or an original verbal prescription. I don't know if a lot of pharmacies are doing this. First of all, I don't know whether they have the capability of doing it. Second of all, since it was only a DEA policy, some pharmacies may not feel comfortable doing it because technically the rule says it can only be done for refills. I think it makes sense for the electronic one because if it was sent to the wrong pharmacy, there should be some way to send it to the correct pharmacy without having to issue a new prescription. So DEA has, Florida law says it's allowed as well, but DEA says that they're going to actually write a rule to allow this, to make it explicit. But in the meantime, it's allowed by DEA policy. Okay, on the bottom, page 103 starts a section on the over-the-counter sale of Schedule 5 products. It probably should say behind-the-counter sale because these products are usually kept behind the counter. But we mentioned this earlier when we were talking about the different classifications of drugs under the Controlled Substance Acts, that there are actually some Schedule 5 narcotics that can be sold without a prescription. And these are the rules for this. And it's mainly products that have some codeine in it for cough suppression, like Robitussin AC and so forth, and maybe some diarrheal, anti-diarrheal products that have small amounts of opium. Both Florida law and federal law allow this. I'm not sure it's done much in practice anymore. Some states have just prohibited it altogether, even though federal law allows it. But what it says is that there are limitations on how often you can do this with patients. And those limitations are listed for you on the top of page 48. And the quantities are limited to a certain amount every 48 hours. It's a little bit interesting to me because the federal law does it in quantities by ounces, but the Florida law does it by milligrams. So I would probably, if it's a Florida MPJE question, they should follow the Florida law and do it by milligrams. So that's what I included for you on the top of page 104. The limitations are you can't exceed more than 120 milligrams of codeine in a 48-hour period, 60 milligrams of dihydrocodeine, 30 milligrams of epomorphine, and 240 milligrams of opium. This is just one of those things you're going to have to memorize these numbers in case they ask you a question on that. There are some very specific requirements in order for the process in order to do this, and since it's not done in practice anymore, you may not be familiar with this. But the first thing is that the dispensing can only be done by a pharmacist, not by a technician. The sale can be done by someone else, but the actual dispensing and the record keeping has got to be done by a pharmacist. And the record keeping requires you keep a bound record book. Again, this rule was written before we had computers, okay? So you have to have a written bound record book that has the name and address of the person, the quantity of the controlled substance you gave them, the date of the purchase, and initials of the pharmacist. I assume you can do it electronically now, but I would still keep a bound record book because that's what the DEA rules, say. The other limitation is the purchaser has to be at least 18 years of age, and again, if you don't know the person, you have to get an ID and document the ID of the person before you sell them these Schedule 5 controlled substances. Okay, there are a couple of other additional requirements for Schedule 3 through 5 controlled substances on the bottom, page 104 and over to page 105. We talked about some of these already. The first one is that you have to get identification of the patient. That wasn't just for Schedule 2 drug, that's for Schedule 3 through 5 drugs as well. Remember, there's some exceptions to that we talked about in the Schedule 2 lesson as well. And the other thing we talked about as well that applies to both Schedule 2 and Schedule 3 through 5 drugs is that all pharmacy permits in Florida must have written policies and procedures on how you're going to prevent fraudulent prescriptions for controlled substances from being dispensed in your pharmacy. Okay, so that's the end of Lesson 20. We'll pick up again with lesson 21 on page 105 in the next lesson.